Whether you want to grow your show to convert listeners into clients, share a message with the world, or build a community, your podcast needs two things. It needs to be visible to your ideal listener, and it needs to bring them maximum value when they choose to listen. In this episode, Isabella Sanchez Castañeda joins us to share her insight on how to get your podcast showing up for the right people and how to keep them listening. Her podcasting experience, her expertise in journalism, and her track record for producing winning podcasts for business owners all lend to some excellent insights in this episode. And we cover the do's and don'ts of podcast cover art if you want people to click on your podcast, the errors that many interview podcasters are making that are fatal to listenership, why more podcasters should consider solo episodes, how to get the best out of your interview guests for your listeners, the secret to converting listeners into clients, and so much more. These are insights that every podcaster should be paying attention. So if you want to become more visible and keep your listeners happy, then keep listening. Thank you for joining me on Podcasting Amplified.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. I wanted to jump into something that I think a lot of podcasters could get some value out of, and that is podcast cover art. What are the do's and don'ts of podcast cover art that you see a lot of podcasters making that could be negatively affecting whether or not somebody clicks on their podcast?
Yeah. Oh, this is such a good topic because there's some really simple things that people can do to completely change their cover art. So one of the first don'ts that I see is I would not put script or cursive fonts on your cover art. Anything too small. So font is going to be the first thing that I focus on. You want people to be able to clearly read your cover art right away. I love to think about it as a billboard down the highway. If someone has to squint to see it, they're not going to look. And so same principles apply for your cover art. Make the font as big and as visible as possible. And it can still be on brand, but you might have to go with the heading font, or you might have to just go bolder with what you normally do. The other don't include too much text on the cover art. So once you have that bold font, that's amazing. You might find that you can't fit as much on the cover art. So a lot of times I see people put their tagline on their cover art. You don't have to. Really, the main things you want is just the title and your name, the host name, or if there's multiple hosts, maybe it's the group name. That's about it. Everything else they can get inside of the podcast description on whatever platform they're on, and that should be more than enough. And then a do have a face on the cover. So faces, if there's more than one person, or just the host's main face, because people really want to know who they're hearing from. Even if you don't have video, having a face on your cover increases the amount of trust. And this might be a little dated now, but I looked on Spotify's top 50 podcasts, and more than half of the top 50 podcasts have a face on the cover. And not just the ones that are the face of someone famous, but also people who have just risen to podcasting fame tend to have their face on there because of that instant connection to the voice that people are hearing.
Love it. Yeah, I really like that billboard analogy because it's similar to when people are like how fast do people scroll through these apps? Just like when you're driving past, people don't take the time to stop and read. So
yeah, and one thing about that is like the cover art on a phone is the size of a US dime. And so it's very, very small, usually slightly smaller than your thumb. So if you are designing on Canva, really zooming all the way out as much as possible and seeing, does the cover art still make sense there? Because if it's really big on your screen, of course it looks really nice. But when you have it so micro, it makes a big difference. And then don't use the first four templates on Canva. Everyone uses the first four. I can imagine them right now. One of them is purple with a little microphone and it's in a circle. One of them just has the white microphone with the waves going through it. And we see those, and those don't stand out because they're the first four templates on Canva. Just taking your time to tweak it. A microphone is not required on your cover art. People get that it's a podcast. You don't have to be in their face about a microphone if you don't have to be.
Yeah. Yeah, I like what you say about Canva. Like I know which ones you mean. And funnily enough, like a lot of these templates, they're made by Canva designers, but I guess they're not necessarily in the podcasting space. And a lot of them don't follow half of these rules. There's tons of text on there, like taglines and tiny right stuff about their business. And, it's just not what a thumbnail is. And just if you want a visible example, if you look at Isa's podcast Visible, then you'll see exactly what she means with that big, clear, bold font next to a headshot. And then what you said about branding as well. I think when we do thumbnails for YouTube videos, I know some businesses, they want to, stick religiously to their brand guidelines, but like you say, sometimes you do have to kind of bend them slightly if you want people to take notice.
Yeah, and a lot of the times I see this with brands that are trying to be luxury. They're usually with that really thin font or a script font. And that's amazing in terms of your website and in terms of maybe even your Instagram post. But on a podcast, it just starts to really fade away just because it's so hard to read. So bending those rules a little bit goes a long way, and you can stick to the color palette that you have, or you can stick to your brand photos and still get that same feeling to come across.
Yeah, exactly. So just rewinding a little bit, you started Visible, your podcast, back in 2021. You've been at it for quite a long time. And it's for business owners who want to launch, improve, get clients from their podcast. And you're an award-winning podcast strategist and producer for personal brands. So what made you decide to get into this space? And particularly, why did you start a podcast back in 2021? What was that kind of main reason? And what triggered you to get started?
The story of my business and the story of the podcast are very intertwined. So I started my business at the beginning of 2021. I was in the journalism space for a while. I thought that journalism was what I wanted to do with my whole life since I was in middle school. And I went to school for it. I went to school for communication, specialized in journalism, and learned how to tell a good story alongside the tools of editing, of video editing, audio editing, all of that, because we were expected to put together the story from top to bottom, and started working in the field, but then kind of realized that it wasn't exactly what I wanted. And at the time, 2021, the job market was not as open. And so I didn't feel like I had a lot of choices. And because my parents are entrepreneurs out of necessity, having emigrated to the US and having started their own businesses because they basically had to, they were very quick to say, start something. Just take the skills that you have and charge people for it and make something happen. And I think that's very opposite of a lot of people's stories with entrepreneurship, where their parents tried to discourage them or try to tell them to go the safe route. I was very fortunate that my parents were happy to tell me to work for myself. And it started in social media. I was a digital editor for a magazine. And so I was on Instagram and building websites all day. So I was like, I could do social media. I could do Instagram for a business, and tried it. It wasn't exactly what I wanted because it didn't have as much of that storytelling component. So for the first year of business, it was really just trying to find what I wanted to do and not feel terrible at, not necessarily because the work was terrible, but just because doing it wasn't super enjoyable. And by December of that year, I was just confused, and it was the holidays, so I took a few weeks off. I started playing, very specifically, it's Gordon Ramsay Restaurant Dash on my phone, which doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately, and listening to a bunch of podcasts. And one of the podcasts that came up was Gary Vee's, and he was saying back in 2021, every personal brand needs a podcast. If you are going to make it, every personal brand needs a podcast. And I wanted something different to do than just talking on Instagram about social media. And I had tried a YouTube channel and none of it was fitting. So I said, okay, why not? I'll start this podcast. I started it December of 21 and did daily episodes for almost 40 days and just talked about whatever came to mind, which was very contrary to what I had learned, very contrary to what I had done on YouTube, what I had done in my journalism career. I just started talking. And as most podcasters eventually learn, podcasting is more than just talking, but that was kind of the initial evolution of the podcast coming to be because I wanted to find a new road for the business and stayed in social media for a bit of time after that until I started refining my own podcast process and made that switch over to podcast strategy once I found what worked.
Yeah, I was listening to Gary Vee around the same time, and I can hear him now saying about how, just call up 50 of your clients, interview them. There, you've got a podcast. Just get started. It feels like quite a long time ago now, but how has it changed your business like over time, and how has the podcast changed over time, or has it stayed relatively steady in terms of sort of what you're doing with it and the results that you've gotten from it?
It has definitely evolved. So as I mentioned, doing the daily episodes in the beginning was enjoyable for me. I think I needed that as a creative outlet to just talk, but it wasn't impacting the business positively. It was actually creating a lot of confusion for people, where I call it now like the bestie zone, where a lot of leads and a lot of people who I had made connections with on other platforms started listening to the podcast and would say, I really feel connected to you. I really enjoy listening to you, but I have no idea what you do. Or they would say, we're like best friends. And when I would go to promote something, launch something like that, they'd be like, oh my gosh, like so sweet. But like, no, we're friends. And that got really frustrating because I thought I was building the personal brand to build the business through the podcast. And so that's kind of when I started realizing something had to change. A little bit more intention toward the audience had to happen rather than just my own thoughts and my own whims, which it's funny because it's a conversation that I have to have with clients every day where they're coming in and they're saying, yeah, I just want to express myself and I just want to talk. And I'm like, I get it. I was there. Let's not do that. And it took a lot of building out the show to be more developed and have clear points and have clear examples and have clear takeaways for the audience. Once I started making that switch, people started saying, oh, you can actually help me with this, or I can hire you to help me with this strategy. I can hire you to do this social media for me. And I was like, yes, of course. And they started clicking a little bit more because the intention was there. And that shift is now what I help people do. And because I talk about that on the show, then it becomes a cycle. I actually, if folks see it now, you'll see that there's gaps in time between the episodes most recently. And that's for a lot of reasons. I wanted to take a pause to add that intention back in even further. But I also, over the summer, did 60 interviews in 60 days for a second podcast called the Thought Leaders Podcast. And that one is just starting to come out because I didn't logistically think it through of how much editing 60 interviews in 60 days takes. But that was incredible. And I did that because my show Visible has always been a solo show. The only guests I've had have been clients. And so I got a lot of questions from people saying, well, do guest interviews bring the business as much recognition or as much money as solo shows? And my instinct was no. And a lot of times it's been proven through clients, like guest episodes are not necessarily authority building episodes for the host. But I wanted to prove it and I wanted to show what could happen if I did it. And so that's being built out right now and will definitely evolve.
Interesting. Yeah, there's a few points that came up there. So regarding like your kind of clients or potential clients or listeners friend zoning you, so to speak, was it that the client, the people listening to the podcast weren't your ideal clients, or were they your ideal clients and it just took them kind of new approach to the podcast to sell to them, basically, or to help them understand what you can do?
I think they were definitely ideal clients. It was they couldn't put together that I could necessarily help, because I was talking about my business journey, like what I was struggling with and what I was going through and the decisions that I was making, but I wasn't focused on what we hear online all the time of like the value that is related to my business. And so I wasn't giving them a new perspective or a new way to see a certain area of their business. I was just sharing about mine. And so the connection of like, oh, she shares this information, I can pay her for information customized to me, wasn't linked well enough. Even though I was making the calls to action at the end, like, oh, and if you want to work with me, like, you totally can. They were like, you just complained for 30 minutes. And it wasn't always complaints, but it would be, I would share about the book that I was reading. And so this might kind of help as an example. So originally in that era of the show, if I was reading a book, I would go onto the podcast and say, oh my gosh, I love this book for all of these different reasons. This book is so amazing. Look at this quote. Look at what they said. This is how I know about the author. So good. Now, if I were to talk about a book, it would be, these are the 3 things you need to know about podcasting that you can learn through this book. And you might not see it yet, but in this episode, I'll show you how. And I would say, you need to hear about this quote and you need to hear about this quote. And I loved this quote because I applied it in this way. And so it can still be about the book that I love, but it's more service oriented and more, hey, person who is taking 20 minutes out of their life to hear my voice in their ears while they do something else, I'm going to make it worth those 20 minutes for you. And that switch, it's not even a huge switch, but it's a dial turn of 10 degrees, made such a difference and still makes such a difference for the people that I work with.
Cool. Okay. So it's like making it more outcome focused for them, basically.
Outcome, definitely outcome, or just people are always thinking, what's in it for me? And so if people are doing that, I don't think there's anything wrong with kind of feeding into that and saying, you're wondering what's in it for you. Let me tell you exactly what's in it for you. This is what you're going to get. I hope you enjoy it. And that is a good quality show, and not to reveal the behind the scenes. But even when we logged on and we were talking about like what we were going to share today, you said, I really want them to get value up front. That is the level of intention that I wish every podcast host had, because a lot of folks don't think, let's pack the value up front. They're thinking, let me share about my weekend. Let me share about the drink that I just bought at the coffee shop. Let me share about all these things and then get into the episode. And that's a really frustrating experience for people who think they're getting or supposed to be getting something of use to them. Yeah,
totally. So on that note, for the people listening, is there 1 or 2 other things that we haven't touched on that if they're at home thinking, I wish I could turn my listeners into clients, but they're just not clicking through, or they're not sort of in the buying mode or whatever, is there anything that they can look into and think about that might be causing that disconnect?
I would say the first thing is asking that question of, do you know what's in it for them? And just sit, like when you plan the topic, or even when you have a guest on, whichever you choose to do, if it's solo or guest, just writing on a sticky note, what's in it for them? And saying, if they listen to this episode, they will get this. And if you have that really clear, it helps. And it sometimes I will have an incredible idea, or incredible to me, and I say, oh my goodness, such a good idea. Everyone in the entire world needs to hear this idea. And I go through the filter of what's in it for the listener. And I can't come up with something besides, I just want to talk about it. And I don't share it. And instead go, how could I share this in a way where the listener gets something out of it? That is probably the best thing. And very related to that is, do you know the situation and limitation that your audience is in. So if you are, because it's the top of the year, not to date the show, but because it's in a time where people are talking about fitness, which is all the time, really. A lot of the times fitness podcasts, for example, can lean to being very preachy or very Pinterest quote-y, where it's like, just do it. You can do it. And get over yourself and you can do it. And then they run out of episodes 10 episodes in, or they're just yelling. And if instead a show like that were to think, what are the situations or limitations that my audience is in? It might be an episode about how to still get a workout in when your kids haven't let you sleep in 3 days. Or how to get a workout in when you're a college student in the middle of finals and what that's going to do for your finals grade. Or it might be, listen to this when you are coming back from an injury but still want to move your body. And it's like, oh, you're speaking directly to the situation and limitation that they're in. And it's deeper than just, you can do it. It's, hey, I see you. I see that there's a challenge in front of you, and I believe that you can overcome this challenge with these couple of tools, and it will be hard, but I'll be here along the way for you. That is such a different feeling than just do it. And how that translates to actually getting clients is when people feel seen by you and say, wow, that service provider understands. Maybe it's not about fitness, but it's about SEO. Right? Or it's about whatever agency services you might provide. That person will say, wow, that agency understands the struggles that my particular business is going through. I trust them to create a custom plan for me. They're not just going to be like the old agency I hired that gave me the templates and made me feel like just a number, because they can see you customize during the show.
Thank you. Yeah. When you say about fitness, it reminds me of Joe Wicks. I don't know if he's popular in the US at all.
I have not heard of him yet.
Yeah, he got really big over here, his YouTube channel and stuff around like COVID time. And yeah, like all of his fitness content is about feeling good, basically, rather than about sort of weight loss or muscle gain. And so it's about feeling good, and he's got exercises for pregnant women and people recovering from surgery and things like that. So it's that empathy about where people are. So I get what you mean there. So maybe there are a lot of podcasts out there where, they don't really understand exactly what their listeners are after. Or maybe they do, but they're struggling because they have an interview style podcast and they get this big guest on or a guest from a company they admire or hope to be a client, and they're not confident with guiding them through the interview, guiding through the conversation, making sure that value is being given to the audience. And now that you've also done an interview podcast, what differences, or you're starting one, what difference have you seen there in the way, in the sense of like getting value to the listener? Do you find it a lot easier for your solo podcasts? And I know, solo podcast is something you recommend to clients. What the difference is there, and how easy is it to get that value across between the two formats?
Yeah. So with solo shows, I think it's easier. It depends on each person's strength, but I think for me, it's easier to sit down, write an episode, and do the research and say, here are 3 points. And I always recommend 3 points. Anything more, your topic's not specific enough, but 3 points. And I say like, boom, I know you got something. I can label it at the bottom and say, what's in it for them? Did I get that across? Is that full? I can check those boxes. With a guest show, it's such a dance, and it's such an understanding of what is my audience thinking and what is the guest thinking. And if you're able to put the audience first, by sometimes allowing yourself as a host to look a little silly, it's going to pay off. So one thing that I would say to make sure that you get value when you're on a guest show is if a guest says a word that 80% of your audience doesn't know, just asking them, what is that? I said the word, like I said, SEO earlier, and you might be like, what is SEO? Like the audience might not know, and just, you can kind of blame it on the audience and say, oh, the audience might not know what's SEO. Or I had a nutritionist on the show and she was talking about macronutrients, and I was like, the audience might not know, what is a macronutrient? And she said, oh, of course, and broke it down, because often the biggest gap to understanding is literally a gap of just like, okay, I understood everything in that sentence except that one word, therefore I did not understand the sentence. So if you can get the understanding as close to 100% as possible, by being someone who's willing to ask the quote unquote dumb questions, that ensures a lot more value for the audience. And I think that's, now that I'm thinking about it, I love this question. Like going back and saying, I didn't understand what you meant by that. Or can you just go deeper into that, is how you get value from a show. A lot of shows follow a template. I think you've done a great job of not following a template, but there's shows that have the same 5 questions where they go, tell me about yourself. Oh, wow, that's great. Can you tell me about your favorite client? Solid. Can you tell me about the biggest mistake you've made? Cool. And they don't listen to the question or listen to the answer. They just go, thanks so much for answering that question that I came up with 5 years ago and never changed. And then at the end they go, great, how can our listeners get more value from you? And you feel like a robot that no one cared about in that interview. And instead, if you're like, hey, I came with 3 questions, but I'm just going to ask a follow-up question in between, you're going to get a much better interview. I think we could go on about this for a while. Clearly, I'm like, wait, I love this question.
Yeah, well, you say about robots, like people are getting worried about AI taking over the role of a podcast host. And if you're asking the same questions every single episode, then that's kind of, you can think to yourself, could an AI do this? Or does it take, do I have a personality? Do I have a way of getting the right information out of people?
Where the human element of podcasting really comes in is your personal curiosity connected to your audience's curiosity. And if you allow it, I'm sure, for example, there's experiences that you've had, books that you've read, conferences that you've gone to, people that you've talked to, where you have something sparking in your head that another host doesn't have. And so saying, hey, so I was at this conference and this thing happened and da-da-da-da-da. Can I ask you about this, like that I think is related? And now the audience is like, whoa, I would have never thought to ask that question because I don't have the experiences that he has. And so it all comes together very nicely. I've told the story, for example, about Gary Vee being kind of the catalyst for my show, and other people's reaction is, oh, I don't like him. And I'm like, oh, okay. And then we have a conversation about that versus you mentioned that you listened to a very similar thing. And I'm like, oh, that's awesome. We have that same background. So those little bits of curiosity is what makes the human interviewer the most interesting rather than just the one who can ask a scripted question.
Yeah. I know he and a lot of kind of creators like who do content like his can be quite sort of love or hate it. So what would you say to a podcaster who runs an interview podcast for their business? Let's say they're in the housing industry, and so they're interviewing professionals within the housing industry, just as an example. And they find themselves asking these questions, and then in the middle of their guest speaking, they realize they've often, a 10-minute tangent about their whole backstory and their schooling and everything like that. And it's, 10 minutes into the episode and there hasn't actually been anything of value for the housing industry professionals listening to the podcast. What would you say the host needs to do in that situation? Or is there anything you can do on the day, or is that something they need to prepare better for? Is that something they need to sort of train?
I think so. In terms of preparation, fixing it for the future, I love the strategy, very similar to what you did, where the first question you ask is a question for the audience, not for the backstory, because that gets the audience interested right away, but it also puts the guest into the zone, the service zone, a little bit more, where they know like, okay, these are my parameters. Like this is what the audience is interested in. So then if your second question is tell me about your backstory, it's a little bit more pointed. I would also say sometimes the backstory is not that important until there's a reason for it. So in the housing industry, instead of starting and saying, tell me about how you got into the housing industry, maybe if you still want the question to be personal, you can say, how did the first house you ever owned influence you as someone selling homes or building homes or whatever it is that they're doing? Or what is your dream home? If you still want the question to be personal. Or you can have them say a big fact and have them say, I built this whole complex and all this stuff. I'm thinking of shopping centers and stuff like that. I don't know why. But, and then just ask them and say, well, what first got you interested in shopping centers? Or, oh, you built this huge 50-story apartment building. Why apartment buildings? What led you to that? And they can still tell you about their backstory, but in a focused way, rather than the question that everyone kind of dreads, which is tell me more about who you are. Because how do you nail that down in anything but a 10-minute tangent?
No, that's really good advice. And even if you can't think of like a super valuable question, if you want to keep it personal, just something different and interesting, like you say, like what was the first house you owned? How did, stuff like that. Because if you want people to continue listening, people can hit play once you've got them for the first 5 minutes. If they've started their commute or they've gotten invested, then they're likely to carry on listening from there on. But if you kind of, if it starts really slow, then they're much likely to skip.
A really easy question to keep in your back pocket is, how did you first learn that? And so anything, if we go back to the example of the cover art, you might say, how did you first learn that? And I would go into a story of like, oh, graphic design and all this stuff, whatever. But you get their backstory in that way, and you might get an answer that you would never expect. Like you might hear from someone, I'm thinking of a money coach, who I've worked with, and asking her like, well, how did you first learn this cash flow strategy? She'd be like, well, I interviewed this many people when I used to work at this big tech company, and that's how I first learned it. And you'd be like, whoa, tell me more about that. But she might not have said that story if you said, just tell me about yourself.
Yeah, I think people can get a bit too focused on like doing things chronologically or in a kind of logical order. So, they'll start with the backstory, then they'll go into the value and so on. But if you think about it from the listener's perspective, it's like we started this interview today, even though the cover art thing had nothing to do with, it wasn't anchored to anything. It's still going to be useful for most podcasters listening. And then once they've got that value, they'll be, they'll want to hear more of what Isa has to say.
Yeah, and I think the reason the advice has been given to start with tell me about yourself is because people think that it's giving people a reason to listen, where they're saying, why should I listen to you? But most of the time, people will listen to the people that have already given them something. So it's like, oh, if I've already learned about them, or if I've already learned something from them, I want to learn about them, rather than I've learned about them, now I want to learn something from them. Because there's probably people with very fancy degrees and very good teachers and titles and everything that may not know how to articulate something for an audience, or may not have a particular set of knowledge that audience wants. So it's doing that dance of why should I listen to you, but also piquing their curiosity enough to get them there.
Yeah, like maybe decades ago when it was harder to get access to, these geniuses and thought leaders and people that have all this information, maybe that authority building at the start of whatever media it would have been, it was really important. But now that everyone has access to thousands of these really smart people and their thoughts and that, It's like the first thing needs to be, what does this person have to offer me specifically?
Yeah.
You also mentioned about explaining words, and funnily enough, the interview that I recorded this morning was with an SEO expert, and I had to make sure to remember to, like exactly like you say, to explain what SEO is, because it's kind of a muscle you have to build. Like these terms that are really now seem obvious to me just because I see them in our industry. It feels like they'd be obvious to everyone, but that's not the case. And there's plenty of terms in their industries that I wouldn't be able to stand either.
Yeah.
So,
and for if anyone is curious about solo episodes, doing that for yourself. So the one example I always use is systems. So I work with some people who are mental health professionals and some people who are operations specialists for businesses. And they both use the word systems in their episodes. And they're like, oh, the systems that you're using. And I'm like, what systems? Like, you can't just say the word systems and expect everyone to know. So I have them at the beginning of their episode define and say, what I mean by systems today is, and the mental health professionals will say the systems, maybe it's internal family systems, which is a type of mental health approach. It might be systems of a family, more tangibly, like how people interact with each other. And I have them. I'm like, you have to define what system you're talking about here. And then the operations people, it's systems is, the automations, tech, and people in your business. And we have them say it at the very beginning of their solo episode so that your listener is not sitting there wondering, what do they mean by systems? And then their mind has gone and the 15-minute episode finished and they didn't pay attention to a single word because they were so confused by just the most core word to your episode.
For sure. That makes sense. Thank you. And as we come to a close for this episode, I just want to ask, is there anything that you wish you'd have known that you can share with people who maybe have just started their podcast at the beginning that would have made your podcasting journey a little bit more easy?
Don't fall for all of the people saying that it has to be easy, and be willing to put a little bit of elbow grease in there. Of if it's with an interview, 5-10 minutes of research goes such a long way. If it's a script, doing a second draft goes a really long way. Editing your show, even a tiny bit, goes a long way. And right now I see a big trend in the podcasting industry of, I don't edit my show. I don't prepare for my guests. I don't plan what I have to say. I just go on and talk. And because I did that, I know there's so much on the other side of 10 minutes of a little bit of extra work. And it doesn't take that much to have a more successful show. But we as humans fall for easy very quickly and say, yeah, I'm not going to edit. I'm just going to talk and I'm just going to do and just going to go. And I wish I had known that it was worth putting in the effort.
Yeah, especially these days with all the AI tools that, claim to do absolutely everything for you, but then they're also doing everything for every other podcaster. So if you put in 15 minutes of human work in there, you're already sort of putting yourself above a lot of other podcasts out there now.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, thank you. This has been really, really helpful. I think the listeners are going to get a lot from this as well. You can find Isabella on her Instagram, Isa Media Inc. And you can find Visible, all the podcast platforms. And then your other podcast as well, the Thought Leaders podcast.
So we are currently releasing episodes every Monday. There are so far 10 episodes up of the 60. And you can find that on YouTube and all the platforms.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, I didn't realize you had 2 podcasts. I need to take a look at that now as well. Is there anything else you wanted to share before we say goodbye for now?
Just a reminder to the audience to stick with their podcasts. Reaching that 10 episode mark and then eventually that 100 episode mark is a huge milestone. So for anyone who's close and getting there, just keep going.
Thank you. Thanks again.
Yeah,
Lisa.
of course.
Speak soon.
Thanks for listening to Podcasting Amplified. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform. We'll be back next time with another conversation offering more insights to take your podcast to the next level and help you to achieve success. Happy podcasting.